With the increase to level 80, there is now a variety of cool new spells to actively hunt, many of which are tied to dungeons, and while you could look to join spell hunting parties in PF, many people prefer to do blue mage content solo. With that being said, here is a simple guide to doing dungeon solo with relatively few and easy to obtain spells, which is where we're going to start. Now unless you're completely new to blue mage, you should already have a majority of the required spells, and even if you don't, none of them should take more than a couple minutes to get. Starting off, our spell list is the standard for any blue build, Etheric Mimicry, specifically Healing Mimicry, as this will greatly help increase our survivability, primarily because of Palm Cure, which is effectively a 60% or full heal on a crit. Next up is another two crucial spells for doing anything solo, Mighty Guard and Basic Instinct. Like Mimicry, these are a no-brainer as it will just increase your durability and damage. After that combo of spells, we have another in Ram's Voice and Ultra Vibration, which is standard for any dungeon build as it will let you just delete packs. And even without Ultra, Ram is just a powerful form of CC for dealing with mobs. Speaking of which, another decent addition is Bad Breath. This provides a damage down and extra CC in paralysis when the enemy can no longer be frozen. Our next staple is Missile. A good few bosses this time around are susceptible to it, making it an obvious choice. But if you don't have it, you can likely go without it. However, this will make things take longer and some fights much more difficult. Moving on to our damaging spells, we have Breath of Magic and Song of Torment, both powerful dots that will let us do damage while also surviving. You'll also want to bring Bristle to boost both of them. And finally, we have our filler spell, which will be Goblin Punch. It is easily our best option as it gets boosted by Mighty Guard. Now you may notice that we still have a good few slots available. You can fill these with whatever damage or utility you have available to you. Though I will note, though it's only needed for Spectral Barbarian and the Hero's Gauntlet, Diamondback is a useful tool if you want some extra security. But most things won't one-shot you, they just come close, so it's not needed for most bosses. Also, I would avoid Moonflute. Even though it greatly increases your damage, it can very easily get you killed when solo. With the spells done, let's move on to going through dungeons. First, you want to make sure to turn on Undersized Party and Level Sync. This will not only allow you to actually enter the dungeon, but it will ensure that you always learn the spells. Once you get into the instance, you need to make sure to activate Mighty Guard and Basic Instinct. After this, you're ready to get started. Begin by doing a wall-to-wall pull, using Rams plus Vibration to easily dispose of those first packs. As for the next set, you have a couple options. You can either wait for your vibration to cool down, or you can fight each pack individually. Both of these take roughly the same amount of time if you're not using any bonus DPS spells. Now, if you choose to fight, then you can just spam Rams, hit the enemy with Breath of Magic, and when they become immune to freeze, use Bad Breath, the CC, and Palm Cure as necessary. No matter which one you choose to do, once you finish off with the packs, you should come to a boss, and this boss is going to go one of two ways. Either it can be missiled, in which case that's all you have to do, or it can't, and you have to do it properly. Now, if you have to actually do the fight, how you're going to want to start each one is by buffing and applying your dots. Once you apply your dots, your main goal is going to be keeping them up and surviving, and the main way you're going to do this is dodging mechanics and using Palm Cure. Now specifically, you're going to want to use it anytime you drop below 50%, anytime you see a stack or tank buster, and immediately after a stack or tank buster. As long as you're being proactive with your healing and not being greedy, you shouldn't die, meaning it's just a war of attrition. As long as you're keeping your dots active, the boss will eventually die. Now, when you're not having to heal, then you can focus on doing DPS, whether it just be spamming Goblin Punch or using any of the other damaging skills you have access to. And that's basically how every dungeon is going to go. The biggest difference is going to be the difficulty of the bosses. Some are going to hit harder, some aren't, some are going to have more difficult mechanics, some are going to have easier mechanics. It just depends. But now that we have the general stuff out of the way, let's go into some more specific tips. Starting with the first dungeon I recommend beginning with, which would be Matoya's, as not only does it have two spells, one from the first boss and one from the second boss, but it's one of the easier ones to do, as Mudman, the first boss, can be missiled, so he's not even a threat, and Nixie doesn't really hurt outside the tank buster, and that's really the only threat in that fight. But more importantly, if you don't have a lot of damage utility, Sea Shanty from Nixie is a fantastic option to pick up and will greatly help you with doing the other dungeons. Speaking of other dungeons, let's go over a few things that you're either going to want to know or need to know, starting with the Hero's Gauntlet. As I mentioned in the beginning, you're going to want Diamondback for this dungeon, because the final boss, the one with the spell, the Spectral Berserker, has a stack that's likely going to kill you without it. Now, past that first stack, he's basically no threat, and you won't have to use it again, but make sure you have Diamondback for that fight. The next dungeon I want to talk about is Amaurot, as this dungeon has 2 DPS checks, the second boss and the last boss, neither of which can be missiled, however the first can. Now, the second DPS check isn't that bad, you should be fine, but the final one can be very close without any extra DPS skills, and is why I recommend doing Matoya's for Sea Shanty, as that should more than solve the issue. And the last piece of specific advice I want to give has to do with bosses, specifically the first boss of Cosmos and the first boss of Dawn Meg. And the reason is they both have attacks that hurt a lot. For the Secret of Solitude and Cosmos, it's their Tank Buster, which can leave you low enough to get killed by autos. The same can be said for the Frog. The Tank Buster isn't that bad, but the stack can leave you incredibly low. So be ready to heal as soon as it goes off. And that's basically everything you need to know to do the Shadowbringers dungeons solo. Really, the hardest part of doing them is actually just knowing the mechanics of the specific fights. You should be fine otherwise. And keep in mind, this guide assumes that you have the bare minimum spells. The more you have, the faster and easier of a time you're going to have. With that being said, if you're still here, thank you for watching, and hopefully you found this guide useful. If you did, consider checking out one of my other guides in the side there, and I'll see you next time for whatever I do next.